Hi, folks. I'm Sam Chandan, the Dean and Silverstein Chair of the Schack Institute of Real Estate at the NYU School of Professional Studies. As with every week at this time, thank you so much for joining us for the Summer 2020 REIT Leadership Series. I'm privileged to co-host this program with my colleagues, Robin Panovka and Adam Emmerich, the co-chairs of the REIT M&A practice at Wachtell Lipton. Robin and Adam are both also members of the NYU REIT Center's advisory board, and Robin is a member of the Schack Institute's board as well. I'm also joined by my friend and colleague, Scott Robinson, professor at the Schack Institute and the director of NYU's REIT Center. Special thanks to Monmouth Real Estate Investment Corporation and Mike Landy, great supporters of the Schack Institute that have sponsored this series. To all of our sponsors, the funds that have been provided to Schack over the last couple of months have really been directed to supporting students who have been impacted by the epidemic, by the pandemic, I should say, and meeting unexpected need-based financial aid. So it's made a real difference for our students, and we appreciate it very much. This has been an amazing series. As I mentioned, every week we kicked off with Sam Zell on July 8th. And over the ensuing weeks, we've had just an amazing star-studded roster of guests. Hamid Moghadam from Prologis, Debbie Cafaro from Ventas, of course, also playing a really important leadership role for the industry at the Real Estate Roundtable. Sherry Rexroad from BlackRock. Last week, Hap Stein, executive chairman of Regency Centers. If you've missed any of our previous guests, head over to our YouTube channel. I'll share a link to that in the chat function. That's youtube.com/NYU Schack, and you can watch those there. Next week, we have John Kilroy, and we have some amazing plans for the fall. So please stay tuned for some big announcements about our series programming come the fall semester. So excited this week that we are joined by Leslie Hale, just an amazing leader in the real estate industry. Adam is going to do the formal introduction. This is really exciting for us. Accolades left and right. The one thing that I'll mention is that amongst her many other commitments, she's also a trustee of her alma mater, Howard University. RLJ, as she and Adam will describe, we couldn't be getting a better and more balanced view of what's going on in the hospitality and hotel sector right now. RLJ owns more than 100 hotels across 23 different states, full service, as well as more focused, smaller properties. This is just a real treat for us, and we appreciate Leslie taking time out of her busy schedule to join us so much. Please use the Q&A feature as you do every week. If you see a question you like, hit upvote, and that will see it rise to the top. That way we'll make sure later on in the hour to ask the questions that folks feel are most pertinent and most relevant. But with that, I will turn it over to Adam to introduce Leslie Hale.
Thanks so much, Sam, and thanks again, Leslie, for being with us here today. It's a real pleasure and privilege to have you with us, and I know the audience is super excited and looking forward to talking with you. Sam did a pretty good job of giving you an introduction already, I have to say. He often leaves me in this position. Your bio has been in the announcements and, of course, on the web. I'll mention that you've had a really fabulous career, being with RLJ since I think 2005, rising to CEO at this point. Before that, after graduating from Harvard Business School and Howard University, before that, you were with Goldman Sachs and GE in a couple of different roles. You've talked publicly about your two loves for finance and real estate, and obviously in your current position as CEO of RLJ, you get to be involved in both of those, and in the pandemic, for better or worse, as we all are these days. So if you don't mind, I'll delve right in and start off by asking you about that. I mean, with your broad exposure to the hotel industry and patterns of movement and travel that you've seen across the U.S. and all the 24 states and D.C. that you're operating in, can you give us a little bit of a sense around the country and over the months since the pandemic began in March or February, what you're seeing, what the impact is?
Sure. First of all, Adam, let me just say, thank you for having me, and hello to everybody who's listening in here. As we all know, this is really unprecedented times, and until now, we've all taken our mobility for granted, and so it is a unique window to be able to kind of look at travel industry overall, which has obviously been severely impacted. If you sort of think about it more broadly, airline travel was down almost 90%. International travel was completely halted. Cruise lines were stunted as well, which had a ripple effect on confidence across the leisure industry. For lodging specifically, at the peak, demand was down almost 80%, and all segments were being impacted, whether it was group, business travel, or leisure. And this resulted in a significant number of hotels being suspended. In our own portfolio, we shut down almost 50% of our hotels. In the second quarter, the industry saw about 33% occupancy, which is the lowest occupancy on record for the industry, with April having occupancy in the low 20%. The vast majority of any hotels that were open were generating negative cash flow, and this resulted in a significant number of hotels, being who had CMBS loans on it, being put into special servicer. If you sort of think about the travel industry as a whole, we represent about 30% of the jobs that have been lost as a result of the pandemic, just to put that in context. When we think about it from a recovery, most industries have come off of their lows, and the summer has really been a tailwind because of the pent-up leisure demand. Airlines, for example, are running at about 30% capacity relative to 10% they were running at the peak. For our industry, we expect demand to recover in the inverse of how it fell, with leisure coming back first, business travel coming back, and then group lagging for some time. Most markets are open right now. Hawaii and San Francisco still have some very tough restrictions, but by and large, most markets are open. We have seen sequential increases in occupancy, on a month-by-month basis. So in July, the industry was at 42% occupancy off a low of 20% in April. And again, that was driven mostly by leisure demand from the summer. The real question is really what's going to happen post-Labor Day as kids go back to school. There is concern that there's not going to be enough business travel or small group travel to offset the leisure demand, and that we're going to see some pullback in that occupancy. As we sit today, we still have about 5% of all of our hotels across the industry that are still closed, mostly group houses. So it's pretty challenging right now for our industry, and there's not a real catalyst to change the current view of the environment for the remainder of the year. I mean, clearly a medical solution would change how things unfold and affect the timing and duration of an economic recovery. But overall, we don't see a catalyst right now. And for lodging specifically, we won't see a full recovery until group demand recovers, and that's going to be a multi-year process.
Leslie, thanks. That's a little sobering, but very, very interesting and detailed. In terms of, there's so much diversity in terms of state and local response and globally as well to the pandemic. Have you found that's made a big difference in your operations in different states? Has the government approach really made a difference, or has it really just been the traffic level that's driven everything?
No, there's been some local implications, but we have really strong operating partners at the local level who help us sort of navigate that. But as you can imagine, for example, in markets where it's sort of coastal and there are beaches, when you see flashes of news stories about people laying out on the beaches, those cities are very sensitive to that, and so that has caused them to put in incremental restrictions and had implications. And so we have had to navigate that both on an individual basis and also as an industry. And so there are various restrictions in terms of levels of occupancy, cleanliness standards that we're having to navigate market by market. But again, we're working with strong brands and strong operating partners that are helping us navigate those issues.
Can you tell us a little bit more about some of those specifics? How do you how do you run a socially distanced hotel? What are people actually doing on the ground to get back into business?
So if you sort of think about your experience from coming in to going up to the room, right? So we have taken measures to densify the public space. And you have, limited exposure at the front desk. There's shields that have been put up like you've seen, everywhere, whether it's a grocery store or drugstore. In some hotels, we have mobile keys, so you may actually bypass the front desk and go up to your room. Additionally, there's been, limited services. A lot of the public spaces have been deactivated, whether it's the the exercise room or the pool area. In many places, they're not functional right now. Sometimes valet parking doesn't exist. You have to self-park because we're trying to limit the amount of interaction that you may be having at any point in time. Additionally, one of the biggest changes is around the cleanliness or cleaning up of your room. So what's happening right now in our industry is that we're spending more time cleaning the hotel rooms between stays as opposed to during your stay. So historically, you would get your room cleaned every day, and now you're only getting your room upon arrival and departure is being cleaned. And the other big change that a lot of hotels have in place right now is that there's really a reduced food and beverage offering in most hotels. Limited number of outlets and limited number of offerings, just given the limited amount of demand that's out there right now.
Yeah, it's quite an adaptation, I guess, huh, for all of us. It looks like you're in the office today. Can you tell us a little about the leadership challenges you faced as, CEO of a publicly traded company with your team and your people and running this operation that's spread across the whole country?
I think that, the biggest leadership challenge is the lack of visibility. And the ability to give, concrete perspective around what direction we should go, in the lack of an environment where you don't have a lot of control, right? This isn't a bank crisis, this is a demand crisis. And the things that are causing the demand to evaporate are not in our control as a business. And so, from a leadership perspective, I've been very focused on making sure that when I'm communicating with my team, that I'm doing it in a way that's both sober and confident. I've been focused on making sure that when I communicate to my team, that I'm being very tactical. Because in this moment in time, people are looking for concrete ways to take action and to move towards some level of objective in an uncertain point in time. I think it's also important at this moment in time to have sort of a high touch approach. And what I mean by that is, when this issue first started, I conducted very small conference calls with my entire organization to make sure that I had touch points with every single person within our organization, not only to talk about what was going on in the business, but also to talk about what was going on in their lives, because many of our lives have been altered and affected by this crisis. And so I think that the tone and tenor of my communication, the clarity of my message has been important. I also think that as I've been trying to navigate this and communicate across our platform, it's been really important to make sure that the strategy that I set out during this crisis has been very simple and been focused on the things that we can control. Our number one priority, since this has taken hold, is to protect our people, to protect our customers, and to protect our cash. And that is and has remained our number one priority. We've also, pivoted towards reopening hotels in a socially and financially responsible manner. And then most recently, we've been focused on navigating through a low occupancy environment in order to sustain ourselves and our balance sheet.
In terms of, the whole work from home thing, is most of the organization, not in the hotels, but in the management, the head office and so forth, is it largely work from home still?
Yeah, we closed our offices in March, obviously out of caution and safety for our associates. And then we reopened our offices after the 4th of July on a voluntary basis only. And so we have anywhere from 5 to 10% of our staff come in on a voluntary basis. And we'll continue to be remote until it's determined that it's safe for us to come back in the office. And even when we do come back in the office, it's more likely to be sort of an A-B structure in order to de-densify in the short run. We're going to continue to watch the trends that everybody else is watching. And more than likely, that the things that we do within our office are going to be consistent with the broader business community, here in the DC metropolitan area.
Do you think this work from home will be a permanent change in the way, white collar office work is sort of organized over the long term, or is it something people are going to be at the end of the day desperate to escape from after this whole experience?
Look, I think people are right to wonder how remote work will influence the new normal, but I think it's too early to determine what's ultimately going to happen. I also think it's too early to determine how efficient people have really been, right? It's easy to be efficient when you can't go get your hair cut or go to lunch. When those things are turned back on and we can move freely, the efficiency will change pretty dramatically. And so while I appreciate that working from home remotely will continue to be in our lives in some form or fashion, I don't think that we should overrule the human desire to interact with others.
Yeah.
I think that post the pandemic, I think people are going to appreciate even more the value to connect with their colleagues, with their clients, on their personal travel. While it's great to see grandma on a Zoom, it's even better to give her a hug.
Yep, for sure. One of the things that a lot of folks that we've talked to during this series, starting with Sam Zell and the kickoff session, have talked about is, are the 24/7 coastal cities. You touched on San Francisco, obviously. I live in New York. People talk about it a lot. Do you think we're in for a change, in terms of the country, with some of these second tier or quasi-rural cities becoming more popular and people fleeing sort of on a permanent basis from, big dense cities that depend on mass transit and stuff like that?
I think obviously it's to be determined, but what I would say is that the things that make urban cities and urban centers great are still there. Whether it is their connectivity, their connection to great institutions like NYU, the quality of the workforce, the international draw that they have, those still exist. And for those of us who've been in real estate for a long time, we know that the pendulum swings and CBD is in favor one year and it's out of favor in the next 5 years. And so I think that while they're on the fringe is a damper of demand for some of these cities, I think long-term that they will be fine. And that long-term, that the real estate will still continue to be very valuable.
Is it too soon for you as, a steward of the assets and businesses within RLJ to have sort of thoughts about rebalancing or modifying the portfolio, going forward between different kinds of hotels and different kinds of geographies? Is that something you're giving thought to? Well, at the same time, you're doing the Lord's work of conserving cash.
Yeah. But what I would say is that there isn't a single CEO who isn't thinking about how to operate on the other side of COVID, right? I mean, for many industries, this has created a blank slate and an opportunity to enact change that may have wanted to do, but didn't have the opportunity to do. What I would say about for us, though, is that there's nothing in this backdrop that we're experiencing that would suggest that we need to adjust our portfolio. In fact, the crisis has actually affirmed our investment strategy in this daily leasing business that we call lodging. We own premium branded, rooms-oriented hotels that are limited service and compact service in nature. These hotels have a lean operating model. They're more efficient and they're less complex because of the smaller footprint that they have, the limited F&B and the meeting space. All of these things have allowed us to be more resilient relative to your traditional full service hotels. And we've seen this in our results in terms of the occupancy, our low burn rate, our ability to get back to break even on a relative basis. And so from our perspective, this has actually affirmed our investment strategy. And while we're hunkered down on, the crisis, about 80% of our staff is focused on that. We have about 20% of our team that is focused on the future and what's going to happen and how we can take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. That makes a huge amount of sense. Obviously, one of the crucial things going on in your business and operations, both before and I assume during and after the pandemic, as well as your relationship with the brands, the flags of your hotels. Have those been very stressed as a result of the pandemic? Most of those brand companies, hotel management companies, have a very broad portfolio, so they may be more impacted than your portfolio and their full service offerings and so forth. Has been a lot of tension there, or has it been pretty smooth?
So, you are right. We do have strong relationships with our brand partners and with our management companies, and no company has been immune to this pandemic. As our revenues have fallen, in some cases to zero for many of hotels, the fees that we pay the franchises, the brands, and the management companies have also gone to zero, right? Because they're a percentage of revenues. And so there is no more greater equalizer than that. And so the interdependency of our relationship is very strong. And so we've been working really well on trying to navigate this crisis. I really feel like the brands are in the foxhole with us. They've been very supportive in waiving brand standards, giving us access to reserves to help mitigate cash flow needs. I think they're just doing a great job in terms of being in the foxhole with us. And I also think that they are taking the lead on helping reimagine segments of our industry that need to be reimagined.
Yeah. And you think that's true across the portfolio, across the country? You haven't seen major variations there?
No, I think it's absolutely true, and it's definitely true across the brands. I think that we're working collaboratively and collectively to figure out how to navigate this. But the interdependency is too great.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. You touched on earlier, socially responsible. One of the big trends, obviously, for public companies and for society, really, in a way, that people have been talking a lot about lately is ESG, stakeholderism, corporate purpose, and social responsibility. Can you just touch on those topics a little bit, if you're willing to, in terms of your role as CEO and RLJ's approach to being a publicly traded company?
Sure. We take ESG, extremely serious, at RLJ. We're very focused on the environmental side every single time that we touch a hotel and we renovate it. As you know, the hotel industry is a very capital intensive industry. We're constantly renovating a segment of our portfolio. And when we do that, we focus on figuring out how we can be more effective from an energy perspective, from a water concentration level as well. We're also on an RLJ platform very focused on making sure that we're promoting various charities, particularly around education. That's important to us. And then governance is very important to us as well. We have a very strong board that is highly independent and is also very diverse. I would also say that, in light of the broader discussion around racial equality, I think it's important for me to highlight that, RLJ is a very diverse organization. We've always valued diversity since we were founded. I'm very proud of how diverse we are as an organization, including our board of trustees. And I really think that RLJ can serve as a real example for the broader REIT industry.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. Obviously, in terms of going back to the ESG part of it, well, the whole lot of it, really. And is it something that you found investors care more and more about? I mean, talk a little bit about your relationship with investors on ESG and diversity stuff. I mean, are you feeling supported? Are you feeling pressured? What's it like?
I would say that there certainly is an increased emphasis on ESG. There's a number of stakeholders, such as investors, who want companies to be able to show tangible progress on ESG. And there's a growing belief that companies who do this well, who are focused on the environment, who are socially responsible, who have strong governance, also have a better track record. And that growing belief will continue to put pressure on public companies to continue to make this a priority. Now, in the middle of this pandemic, it may not appear that this is the key priority as people are trying to deal with solvency. But I think it is important, and I think on the other side of COVID, it will continue to be important.
Yeah. And in terms of, obviously American public companies, including REITs, and REITs in particular for a whole variety of reasons, have come to be owned more and more by a smaller number of index funds. Have you found big differences among active investors and index funds in their approach to these sort of things, or not so much?
Not so much. Obviously, I think that the large indexes have, a large scale governance platforms that are very focused on this. But I would say, broadly speaking, all investors are starting to have some level of focus within their investment thesis around this as well.
Right. One of the things that, again, we've talked about with a lot of folks in the REIT industry on these webinars and over the years is what's really been the driving force between various sectors. Some sectors like, regional malls, you have huge proportion of the industry in the publicly traded REIT sector. Other sectors, not so much. Obviously, the REIT industry has ballooned enormously over the last 25 years. Do you see that continuing in terms of, in your sector in particular, migration of assets into publicly traded REITs? Or what factors do you think are influencing that in particular?
Look, I think that, this pandemic has highlighted stresses for various types of asset classes. And, I think it will challenge, which asset classes should be in a public, vehicle, given the volatility and nature that can occur. And so it will be interesting to see how people digest, the trends that are happening in, various sectors, right? I don't think this pandemic has created a paradigm shift. I think that it has accelerated certain trends. Mm-hmm. And so those trends will benefit some, like industrial, storage, logistics, data centers, and it's going to be a headwind for others like retail and office. And so I think that for the retail, office, and mall sector, I think that you'll see your shrinkage, and for other sectors that that are benefiting, you'll see an increase in assets flowing, in there. I would say the way I sort of think about it is there's 4 buckets that a company can fall into, right? There are companies that are going to see incremental demand. There are companies that are going to have, permanent demand impairment. And there are companies that are going to have temporary demand shock, like Rosen. And then there's innovation. And so I think it really is predicated on where you fall within that bucket to whether or not you're going to see growth within those asset classes. I think on the incremental demand and innovation, you will. I think for those that straddle, permanent impairment or temporary demand shock, I think it's going to possibly shrink.
In terms of your own company, RLJ, are there any days when you wake up, particularly during the pandemic or otherwise, and think, well, I'd be happier if I were a private company with similar financial leverage, or do you have distinct benefits from being a public company?
Look, I having done both on the private world and the public side, and obviously been involved recently in merger activities over the last 3 years, I've seen, lots of different perspectives. I would say that I think there are meaningful benefits for being on the public side related to access to capital. And, even in this, environment, if we needed to, we could access the markets. And I think that's always going to be important. Right now on the public, on the private side, the debt capital markets is frozen for lodging. And, equity is searching for deep discounts. And so I think having access to various sources of capital is always going to be important in an asset class that is as cyclical as lodging.
Yeah. Well, you touched on M&A. And again, that's a topic that polarizes people to a certain extent, and some people think it's, you know, ego-driven or prone to failure. What do you think we'll see M&A in the lodging world or in the REIT world over the next 12 to 18 months, more or less than in the past?
You know, look, I think that this pandemic is going to have significant financial implications for many industries, the depth of which is still yet to be determined. I think that many companies are going to have impaired balance sheets, and not to their fault. This is not an issue about being over levered. This is about no revenues. No company was designed to sustain zero revenues or the low level revenues that we see today. And so as a result, on the other side of this, there may be companies whose balance sheets require them to seek consolidation. I think it's too early to determine the who, when, and how, but I think that could be a catalyst for consolidation.
Very different from the financial crisis, or on that front, similar to the great financial crisis?
I think it's different because I think that the recovery is going to be slow, and during the financial crisis, companies could still sustain themselves on an individual basis. We weren't at zero revenues. We might have had lost meaningful revenues, but it wasn't to the depths of which we are today. And if you think about the hotel industry right now, we're generating negative operating income. We didn't do that in the financial crisis. So we were still generating positive income. We're generating negative income today. And it's until we see a path towards break even, that's going to impair balance sheet. So I think it's fundamentally different in terms of the depth of what we're seeing right now.
Talk to Leslie about the recovery and the trajectory of the recovery. I mean, people have been talking a lot lately about this so-called K-shaped recovery. Are you in that camp, or do you have a particular letter that you're voting for in terms of what the recovery is going to look like?
I don't have a letter in as much as I think there's going to be many factors that influence the shape of the recovery, right? But our general house view is that the shape of the recovery is going to be more like a check mark, right? It's going to be a slow recovery off of a steep decline, and the slope of that line was going to depend on how long this crisis lasts, and which is obviously going to be influenced by a medical solution. If a medical solution comes next year, the steepness of that curve will change if it doesn't versus if it doesn't, right? I think you also have to look at, is there going to be a gap between the government stimulus that's been put into the system versus the actual recovery? Is that gap small? Is that gap large? That's going to have implications. I think also the level of distress that businesses and individuals are seeing, means that a lot of people are going to be focused on rebuilding their own balance sheets in the early stages of a recovery, which means that the rate of recovery is going to be stunted and prolonged. And so I think there's so many factors, but ultimately for us, we believe it's going to be a check mark shape.
Yeah. But it's sobering. Do you think is there a downside scenario you're preparing for? Is it just a question of dragging along the bottom of the check mark, or is there any worse scenario that you're planning for and thinking about as a downside?
Look, I can never say never, but I think what we saw in April when we were running at 7% occupancy, I think was pretty bad. I would like to think that where we sit today, that we won't get back to those lows, and that, at a minimum, we're going to hover around where we're at today. We might see some pullback as leisure demand drops off, but I don't expect us to go back to the April lows. Yeah.
You talked a little bit before about, in the context of ESG, about diversity and leadership. Do you think that's something that, putting aside the public company context, how can we be doing better on that front? What's the advice? What are the lessons? Everybody is so focused on wanting to do better. Are we actually doing better, or are we just talking about it?
I would say that, look, I think that there's been some progress, over the last, call it 10 years or so, particularly as it relates to diversity around women. I would say, thinking about it from a real estate perspective, I think that, we see a lot more women on the investment side within real estate. We've recently seen a number of women who've taken on CFO and COO roles, and that's important because those roles could ultimately lead to being in C-suite, the CEO role. I think about Lisa Palmer, Debbie Harmon, Jody McLean, all of which are great executives. While there's still some work to be done on diversity around women, there's been meaningful progress. But I would say that there still needs to be a lot of work around minorities and people of color within real estate, and particularly in the leadership ranks within real estate. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there, and I think that in order to see effective change, business leaders need to be committed and deliberate about adding leadership, diversity to their leadership team. While it's important to add diversity at all levels of an organization, it's most impactful when you add it to the executive level, because those individuals will play a key role in helping drive it through the overall organization. But I think there's still a lot of work to be had on the minority front. And I think that being deliberate about adding it to your executive team is going to be important. And even when I think about my own career, what allowed me to be successful in terms of getting into a leadership role and then being successful in a leadership role, I think that, not only do leaders have to be deliberate about providing the opportunity, and let me be clear, I had to perform. Even though I got the opportunity, I had to perform. But absent getting the opportunity, I wouldn't be here today. The other element that needs to coincide with the access is support. And that's support in the form of mentorship and sponsorship. I don't care what leader there is today. You can say Debbie Cafaro or Jamie Dimon. They did not get to their leadership role without sponsorship and mentorship along their career, and that needs to be provided, as well for minorities that are within the various organizations in which we lead today. I think the other element that's really important as you think about addressing diversity is making sure that the environment that you're creating is one where individuals can bring their whole self to work. Is this an organization that truly believes in a meritocracy? Is it an organization that truly believes in the value of diversity of thought? Is it an organization where you can look past gender and race and focus on the true talent that somebody brings? When you do that, you allow individuals to perform at a very extraordinary level, and and that benefits an organization, and that's what's happened for me. So my advice is to make sure that you're focusing on adding diversity in your leadership ranks, providing support along the way, and making sure that the environment that you're creating allows individuals to bring their whole self to work.
I'll just jump in, and I want to reinforce the points that Leslie just made. For our students, we're the largest real estate program in the world across 4 different degrees, lots of other corporate and executive education programs, lots of recruiters and firms coming to campus. I think everyone has the right talking points about valuing inclusion and diversity in their recruitment efforts. But students, whether they're at Schack or any other program, I think are also looking at the management teams. They're going to the website, they're seeing who's in leadership roles, and this comes back to Leslie's point. If someone sees that there isn't a diversity of thought and experience and background in the leadership team, that sends a very strong signal about the role that it plays at the firm, the level of importance that's assigned to it, and whether or not it's going to be a firm in which folks from a diversity of backgrounds have the opportunity to identify, find, and pair with mentors and advance through the ranks. And that is, I think, as important a signal to folks as sort of the talking points that firms have gotten quite savvy about bringing to the table about valuing diversity and inclusion. So I appreciate that very much. If we can jump in, Adam, with a couple of the questions that have been sent in advance, a whole bunch that have been shared on the Q&A now. And again, Leslie, really appreciate your joining us. Some of this is stuff that you've touched on already, but folks are desperate for more of your insights on some specific issues. One is that with some headwinds to the CMBS market and a resumption of robust CMBS issuance, given the role that CMBS plays in providing debt to the hotel sector, does that have any significant or potentially lingering impact on liquidity for hotels?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that the lack of robustness in that market is going to put pressure on owners who are already facing negative cash flows, right? So their ability to refinance, to seek alternative liquidity sources, is actually going to create a distressed seller, in this market. Because what's going to happen is that a lot of lenders, they don't want to take back an asset that has negative cash flows. And so they're going to be looking and putting pressure on borrowers to solve these issues by forcing them to sell the asset. So I think a lack of a capital markets, a lack of a debt product is going to create, distressed sellers.
So is that a potential opportunity for some of the participants in the market to actually make some acquisitions? Or are folks at this point perhaps hesitating or proceeding in a more reserved way and thinking about expanding their portfolios?
On the surface, it's going to create, buying opportunities, but you also have to have the debt capital markets in order to finance that as well, right? I mean, the returns that people are going to be seeking are going to be predicated on having some level of leverage. I think the other thing that makes it very complicated on the opportunity side is the level of uncertainty about how long this is going to last and the depth of it. How do you underwrite the first couple of years of owning a lodging asset that's a daily leasing business in terms of how much drag are you willing to carry in terms of looking at a hotel asset? So I think it's a very complicated, equation. Yes, I think that this situation will create buying opportunities, but I think that you won't see a lot of volume of transactions until you have some clarity towards a break-even, ability to reach break-even at a minimum on the lodging side.
Robin?
Thanks, Sam. Leslie, a number of questions have come through about technology. A lot's being said about COVID accelerating various technological trends. In the hospitality space, I guess trying to consolidate a few questions, are you seeing more need for robotics? There's been some articles written about how people like to have their food delivered by robots rather than humans these days. On the one hand, focus on that. On the other hand is the Airbnbs of the world and the technology that's leading to that change. How do you think about both of those?
Look, I think that technology will play a role in every industry. I think that there will be technology such as mobile key, as I mentioned earlier, that will play a role in the new normal. But I would say for lodging specifically, keep in mind that we're in the hospitality industry, and to be hospitable, it requires guest-facing, interaction. And so I would say that while there will be some advances, I think that it will still be, a high guest-facing, industry long term. As it relates to, Airbnb's technologies, look, Airbnb has been around a while for now. We've accepted as an industry that it's not going anywhere. And while, Airbnb was impacted by COVID like every other industry, we have seen it come back relative to the leisure side of the equation. I think that where Airbnb will be impacted is that many of the other verticals that they were trying to enter, like business travel and group travel, I think that will be impaired. I think this is an opportunity for the lodging industry, particularly related to the brands, to differentiate themselves around cleanliness and safety and things of that nature. So while I think that the kind of technology associated with alternative lodging sources will continue to be there, I think their growth, may be stunted in the near term.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks. Scott?
I think Scott's observing today, but Leslie, just a follow-up question that's come in. For some of the and it may not be possible at this point to really foresee or speculate about this, but for some assets that ultimately proved to be, non-viable in the market. Some of the ones that you described where, the owner operator isn't able to, get the cash flow, in the right place, where there's the potential, there's an incentive to try and dispose of it as a distress sale. If there are a subset of assets out there that are not viable as a hospitality hotel, what are some of the potential alternative uses? I realize it's a highly speculative follow-up question.
I would say that, obviously it depends on the location of the asset and where it's at, but we're already seeing, in some markets like New York, there's been a couple of announcements of a few hotels that are not reopening, and they may be converted to either office or multifamily of some sort. We're seeing in some assets that are being disposed of, we're seeing multifamilies, investors coming in and bidding in on those assets. So I think that's a viable alternative. We're also seeing universities that are going to be looking to densify their campus, look at possibly buying hotels and converting them to student housing. So, that's happening in not in large droves or waves, but it is a possibility that will happen as people determine whether or not a hotel is still viable. I think right now, about 5% of all hotels are still not open. And those are largely large group houses because of the lack of group business in order to support that. And so, it's to be determined how that will ultimately unfold.
Yeah, and I think, in the case of NYU, I don't think we've acquired any hotels in Manhattan, but I know of at least one case where we're using a hotel in Manhattan to achieve exactly the goal that you described in lowering the degree or extent of density on our campus for the fall semester. Adam?
One question, Leslie, that we got here through the Q&A is whether you feel that sustained low interest rates and long-term capital in the unsecured debt market could bring cap rates down for certain asset classes. A little bit of a finance question, but obviously crucial overall.
Yeah, look, I think that low interest rates are helpful, and then obviously you have a setup relative to attractive valuations today. I think the thing that is missing that will impact interest rates at whatever point is the lack of visibility and lack of certainty. And that uncertainty will continue to create the gap in terms of putting all those pieces together to really bring together a volume of transactions.
Yeah.
Leslie, in terms of the government's response, the federal government, the CARES Act and so on, how helpful has it been to your business and the operators and Flag's businesses, and what more would you have hoped for?
That's a complicated question. Look, what I would say is that for most public companies, I think many people saw individuals who took PPE money and other forms of money having to give it back. So a lot of the public REITs have not participated in many of those programs, whether it was the PPP program, which we didn't participate in, or other programs which we didn't qualify because of various metrics. And so I would say that we have not necessarily participated on a broad basis within our industry. What I would have liked to have been able to see is that I think that it was not really taken into consideration the level of employment that the lodging industry provides and the leisure industry provides in aggregate. The number of jobs, as I mentioned before in my first response, we represent about 30% of all the jobs that have been lost. And so I think having found a way to allow the lodging industry to participate more robustly in those funds could have helped preserve some of those jobs, and I would have liked to have seen that. I mean, keep in mind that this is an industry where we have a high hourly wage population, and we have a high minority, population. And so, as a minority leader, it's important to me to see that those employees are sustained. And so I would have liked to have seen those programs allow us to keep, more of those people employed.
Leslie, we keep putting you on the spot. You're being a good sport about this. The most popular question that's come back is pivoting a little bit away from hospitality. David is asking about the composition of boards. You work with a great board. We've seen over the last couple of years, I think, a significant and long overdue increase in the number of women being appointed to boards. What are your thoughts on the broadening of board diversity to include communities of color, to include LGBTQ individuals, and are there things that, as an industry, we might be thinking about or doing to help support that process?
Well, I think it's immensely important, right? A board's responsibility is to oversee the assets of any company and to oversee the strategy as well, right? And so having diversity of thought, diversity of experience, and diversity within race and gender is important. And so I highly support, those efforts. And we're seeing a lot of companies, make great strides around starting that conversation of saying, hey, we need to think about this differently. I'm starting to see a lot of inquiry on the technology side in Silicon Valley, reaching out and looking for directors on their private companies, on their portfolio companies, to give people a shot there that will hopefully ultimately lead to their ability to get on a board on the public side. And so I think there's a lot of effort going on, and I think that the biggest thing that we can do is be aware, be committed and deliberate about adding that, and I think that's starting to happen now. And so I think creating those pipelines and those funnels to help some of the very talented individuals get on the board, I think that's underway. I'm not quite sure there is an extra step other than executing. So I think there's an open dialogue, there is a path forward, and now it's just curating the candidates and helping them get on the board. So I think it's underway based on what I'm seeing, both publicly and non-publicly on the board side.
Adam, take us out.
Sure. Leslie, I don't know if you have any final advice. As Sam mentioned at the beginning, we have, a lot of students in the audience and who will watch the videos. If you were in their shoes today, not so much only on the, minority diversity and inclusion front, but just generally, if you're starting out in the real estate business today, what's your core advice to those people?
First of all, I really appreciate that this is a tough environment for young people who were in school today. My heart goes out to the seniors who are going to have a different experience than they either planned or hoped for. My advice would be that to the extent that you are able to find someone to work for or with, that you should do it. Don't let a great crisis go to waste here. This is really an opportunity to learn so much from what's going on in this environment. Even if you have to work for free, I would do it. Because the amount of learning that's going on right now, whether it is on risk management, balance sheet management, how to navigate a crisis, there is so much learning going on. And to the extent that you can find a space where you can have a front row seat on that, it could be better than an MBA in some respects. And so my advice would be, don't let this opportunity be wasted, to find someone to work with, even if you have to work for free. I think the other thing that I would say is that as we sit in this moment in time, study the leaders that are out there, the ones that you're seeing every day, whether it's corporate America or in our government. And watch their approach and what they're doing and how they're navigating this current time. and file the observations that you're having away, so that as you become a leader, you can decide what kind of leader you want to be. And using what you're seeing today, some of the good examples and some of the bad examples of what to do and what not to do. And so for me, it's about taking advantage of the crisis to try to learn as much as you can, and studying the leaders who are trying to approach this crisis is the advice that I would have for students today.
Leslie, thanks so much. I hope we don't inundate you with a whole hundreds of people offering to work with you for free, because you're an impressive leader, and I would sign up for that if I were coming out of school. So it's been tremendously appreciated to have you with us today, and inspiring, and tough times that you're going through as a company. So you're really admirable, the work you're doing to lead the company through that. Just really admirable. Super happy to have you with us today.
No problem. Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Take
care,
care.
all.